You work your job, it's stressful in the beginning, you're learning a bit, but then after like 5-10 years, you're not a top performer, but you're not getting that much better. You could spend another 10 years and all that's going to change is it's going to be more comfortable, more fluent as it is. And a big part of this is what I talk about in the book is Anders Ericsson's research on deliberate practice, which is this idea that simply doing something over and over again tends to just make it more automatic. It doesn't necessarily make you better at it, or if it does so very slowly. And so often what we need to do to master our skills when we've reached that fluent stage is a kind of unlearning, is a kind of, okay, we need to bring back the deliberate attention, make it more effortful, focus on things that have long since been pushed to our subconscious to actually make improvements. And that's uncomfortable and it's difficult. And so I think that's one of the real reasons why you need this mastering mindset to make progress. Because just showing up at your job and just doing it for another 10 years is not going to make you that much better once you've reached that plateau. It's just going to make you more comfortable.
Today's episode is proudly brought to you by Effortless. Effortless is the ultimate solution for startups and SMBs seeking seamless money management and compliance handling, e-invoicing and e-way bill generation with just a couple of clicks, slashing collection efforts by a staggering 90% through the magic of automated follow-ups, snapping a quick photo of your bill to instantly log expenses. With Effortless, you get the power of a consolidated bank account view, seeing both business and personal accounts seamlessly integrated. With Effortless, making UPI-like payments is a breeze. Effortless keeps you on track, ensuring your finances and compliance are always in top shape. Effortless wasn't just created by anyone. It was crafted by chartered accountant turned entrepreneurs who understand the pulse of startups and SMBs. Visit www.goeffortless.ai and embark on a journey that will redefine the way you do business. Effortless, because managing a business should be anything but a hassle. Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of ContraMinds. In this episode, I am talking to Scott Young. Scott Young is an author, programmer, and an entrepreneur. Scott's work has been featured in the New York Times, BBC, TEDx, Pocket, and Business Insider. Scott is also the author of the Wall Street best-selling book, Ultralearning. Scott's new book, Get Better at Anything, is out in the stands now. I had a chance to catch up with Scott and talk about the book and what does it take to build a mastery mindset. His ideas and the research that he's done for the book was shared with me, and he had fantastic ideas on the components and the tenets of building mastery. Over to my conversation with Scott. Hi, Scott. Thanks a ton for joining the podcast, and it's absolutely a privilege to talk to you. Thanks a ton for taking time in the midst of your busy schedule, given that you're launching this new book. So, thanks a ton, and lovely having a conversation with you.
Well, I mean, having conversations, especially about the new book. This is my full-time job right now, so it's really my privilege. Thank you for having me on it to talk about my book and some of my things that I've been working on for the last couple of years.
So first things first, congrats on this new book, Get Better at Anything. It's fantastic, especially a book that talks about the nuances of how you build mastery. So that's something that I really thought was very interesting, and congrats. And I'm sure this is going to get a lot of interest, and it's going to get a lot of big write-ups and reviews as you go along. So Congrats
Oh,
to
well,
you.
thank you. Yeah, hopefully, fingers crossed. I mean, when you write a book, we're recording this before the book actually comes out, and when you write a book, you're essentially like you're spending multiple years of your life like in this rabbit hole working on this project, and then you just hope when you surface at the end of it that people are going to be like, oh yeah, that was good, and not looking at you askew like, okay.
So, Scott, I first wanted to, get to your backstory.
Yeah.
And clearly, you've been doing this for a lot of years.
Hmm.
And what was the trigger for you to actually do research and, write about how to learn about learning and
Yeah.
doing research around mastery? So, what's the trigger and interest to do this kind of work?
Well, I mean, I have a very unusual story because, like, the right kind of background for doing this sort of book is, I got my PhD in psychology or some social science field, and then I did some like narrow research program where I proved some like very small fact about X, and then I get a splashy book deal and I get to tell everyone I'm from Harvard. I'm not that kind of expert. I don't know whether you could even call me an expert. I prefer to call myself a learning enthusiast, but I am someone who basically I started writing um, my own kind of personal essays and this kind of stuff on a website when I was 17, which was a long time ago. And one of the topics that emerged early on, especially because I was a college student when I was doing a lot of this writing, was learning how to study. And this was sort of an area where I started getting traction. And as the blog grew, that interest deepened. And after I graduated, I did a few sort of these little what I call little ultra learning challenges or learning experiments. So one of them was learning MIT's computer science curriculum. I did a little project doing that over a 12-month period of time that got me some attention or notoriety or whatever you want to say about it. And then a year later, I did a project with a friend. We went traveling around the world learning multiple languages. And these individual projects kicked off a kind of a deeper interest in cognitive science and the science of learning itself. And so that first culminated a little bit in my book, Ultralearning 2019, that went on to be a Wall Street Journal bestseller. And that was sort of talking a little bit more from a personal perspective. So, talking about some of my projects, some projects of people that have really inspired me, and then kind of digging into a little bit of the basic principles of cognitive science, of the science of learning. And more recently, in like the last 5 years, it really deepened into a much more serious research project. So this Get Better at Anything was a little bit less personal, a little bit less about me and what's worked for me, and more just me reading hundreds of books and like almost thousands of papers, trying to synthesize an overall picture of the science of learning. So what do we know about learning? And I tried to be as much of a generalist as possible when doing this book, because I think if there's any advantage of being someone like me, it's not being, the expert on some super narrow fact X that I got my PhD in, but of looking at the anthropologists and the economists and the, psychologists and the cognitive scientists and all these different fields, all these different ways of looking at it, all these different domains, and asking what are the broad things that seem to be true across all these domains. And so, in this book, I'm covering things like mathematicians solving problems to, fighter jet pilot training to science fiction writing to jazz improvisation and all these different kinds of subjects to try to really get as broad a view as possible of how do people learn, what are the basic mechanisms for learning, what are the ingredients that need to be there to make improvement, and what are the things that are kind of like the rate limiting steps that make it hard to improve, which is obviously something we deal with. And so I hope that the audience who is going to read this book is someone like me who's interested in this topic and would like kind of a survey introduction to some of these ideas, some of these big ideas that are important in understanding how we learn.
Fantastic. Uh, so the first, thing that hit me when I started following you a couple of years back, and then, when I had a preview to this book, one question that popped in my mind was, how do you differentiate between mastery and excellence?
Mm. I don't know. I haven't really thought about that. I think for me, a lot of these words that we use in everyday English, they don't have really technical definitions. So mastery, in some podcasts I've had conversations where we talk about mastery, and mastery means some kind of like elite level of performance.
Mm.
I know, and some people for that reason don't like the word mastery because they're like, well, I'm not going to be, I'm not going to be Tiger Woods at golf. I'm not going to be, Bill Gates as a CEO. So like, this is irrelevant for me, right? I just care about getting better, which is one of the reasons I titled it "Get Better at Anything." And to me, I think of both mastery and excellence and these concepts as just being like there's a continuum of
Mm.
proficiency that we have with skills, from the person who knows nothing, the person who's starting out, the person who is like kind of a middling performer, to someone who's really good at it. And mastery just is what we define as being at kind of the tail end of that spectrum. Now, people can do the cutoff point differently. And so, I mean, if we're talking about world class performance, where there's only like a handful of people in the world who are at that level, I mean, most of us are never going to master anything. But I think of it more directionally. I think of it more like going from wherever you are to another increment forward. And it is different at different stages. And I get into that in the book, that there's differences between being, the number 5 golfer and trying to become the number 4 golfer to, I I'm trying to like, swing the ball so it like hits the fairway. Like those are different problems, but I think they involve a lot of the same mechanisms. They involve a lot of the same background research and the same principles of learning. So that's really what I care about, is those principles. And however we want to define words like mastery and excellence is, I think, up to the reader.
Okay, great. Uh, there is one point that you really make in the book, which is the pride of achieving excellence versus the pride of achieving mastery. Right? There
Mm,
are different motivations that people have. Right?
mm,
Because you talk about what you call as your see, do, and feedback loop. Right? That's the
hmm.
principle that you
Yeah.
largely talk about in this book. And therefore there's this whole feeling that there is a different pride in achieving excellence, and there is a
Right.
different pride in achieving mastery. In your research, what did you think were the differences that you saw, which the nuances, so to speak,
Hmm.
that you could capture, and what is it that you learned out of the vast amount of research that you have done for this book?
So I think I know what you're getting at, and I think if I can, hopefully, I'm following your thread in the right direction here. There is a distinction in a lot of the learning research on what are called like mastery motivations versus it's usually called performance motivations. So the classic context of that is like if you have a group of students in a math class, right? There's going to be some students that are mostly motivated to get an A in the class, and there's
Mm.
going to be some students that are motivated to learn the material. So learning the material is the mastery motivation, getting the A in the class is the performance motivation. And in general they kind of talk about like the mastery motivation is probably better in the long term, especially in a classroom environment where you know the getting an A in a class usually doesn't fully capture the learning objectives of the course. So it's possible to get an A in the class and have maybe a more superficial understanding that's desired. And at the same time, you can do things that will allow you to get the A that are not going to be good for setting you up for long-term mastery. So, maybe just memorizing things that you were supposed to have really understood,
Mm.
cramming so that, you're going to forget it right away, but it'll help you on the test. These are things where these kind of motivations can be in contrast. I mean, my basic assumption is that pretty much anyone who is reading a book like this has a mastery motivation. I mean, if you had a performance motivation, the easiest way to pass a test is to like get someone who can help you learn that particular test, right? It's
Mm.
someone who can be like, okay, well, this is exactly how you practice for this particular exam, and these are the little tricks and little like hooks that you can use to cheat your way into getting
Yeah.
a better mark than your actual understanding would normally allow. Whereas the kind of person who's going to sit through and read a fairly densely cited popular nonfiction book about learning, about mastery, is someone who wants to improve for itself, who wants to have that as a goal. So I have the privilege, I think, of being able to talk to an audience that largely has the right motivation. And I think you're even listening to podcasts as you've made it in a few minutes. You care about mastery. You're not just like, okay, I want to just narrowly get by on this particular class or this particular exam, even if that is also a goal of yours. And so I think the mastery motivation is something that binds my readers and my audience together. And I think the mastery motivation is so powerful because a lot of what you're dealing with, I think, in a lot of educational research in that context is the problem that a lot of students are just not motivated, that a lot of students don't really care about what you're teaching them. And so you have this problem of like, well, you're not only trying to teach them the right way, but you're trying to teach them in a way that like using carrots and sticks to get them to do the work. And, we even talk about that there's a chapter I write on mastery learning, which is a sort of a philosophy of teaching classes, which avoids using assignments and quizzes for grades so that, if you fail one, that you haven't like hampered your ability to pass the overall class. But obviously I understand why teachers do that, because if you don't assign points for intermediate homework or quizzes, students won't try to study for it because they have a performance incentive. So I think, that is the real benefit, the real joy of being able to write a book like this, is that you're essentially filtering out to only target an audience that actually cares about mastery.
Yeah. Uh, See, one of the things that I see as I read this book, uh, some of the thoughts that crossed my mind was this big shift that's happening in the way we work, right?
Mm,
So if you look at it 100 years back, we
yeah.
were in a industrial mindset or a factory mindset, which is really around, uh, you know, uh, you're pretty much mass producing goods, and therefore you're getting the stuff out of the factory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now I think you're moving to an era where you're actually doing knowledge work, and therefore the need for mastery in a job is more important than what it was before, right?
Yeah.
Yet, do you believe the organizations leave at one point? I think let's leave the students aside, but I'm a beginner getting into a work world, and I'm actually moving up my career. One of the challenges that I find is if you don't have a mastery mindset, okay, what happens is you just are not phenomenal in your job. The Edison example that you
Yeah.
give in the book, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that if I'm actually in a job and I'm at a workplace, the fact that the new workplace of the future requires a mastery mindset, and therefore if I were to actually agree on that as the direction that workplace is changing, what would you say are the principles that I need to build in what I do to build mastery in anything that I do?
Well, I think again, understanding these basic principles of learning is so important because I think this is a topic we're not really taught that much about. So, I mean, if you could go through, 16 years of schooling and never encounter a single class where they talk about how learning works, how memory works, all the research we've discovered about this subject. And that's somewhat unfortunate because, it makes people, it puts people in a position where they're often, they're relying on their own intuitions about what's the right way to learn and how people improve and how they get better at things, which can sometimes be accurate. I don't want to say that, like, if you spent 16 years learning in school, you have some idea about how to pass tests and study for things. But there's also a lot of blind spots. And I even covered some of these in my last book. Like one of the classic ones is retrieval versus review. Students, when you give them these like measurement tests, they think that reading their notes over and over again is the right way to remember the information, that is a better method. But actually, when you test them, they do better with repeated testing than with repeated reading and rereading. And so there's a lot of these little blind spots. Spacing is another one. People tend to think you learn more when you're cramming, but you actually are more efficient learning when you space things out. But I think even at a deeper level, there's issues with, we're talking about mastery in the long run. One of the things that I think is a common belief is that you get better and better just with more experience. And this is one of the things that I've had to push back on because Malcolm Gladwell published a very fun and engaging book called Outliers, and it popularized this idea of research called the 10,000 hour rule. And as with all popularizations, I don't want to be too hard on Malcolm Gladwell because you're always simplifying things and people take ideas in ways you didn't expect. But one of the ways that he took in that he didn't expect, or that I think is not a good reading of the research, is that, well, the key to getting good at something is to spend 10,000 hours doing it. And that's not actually what the research shows. That spending a lot of time doing something leads to confidence and it leads to fluency. Now, fluency, I think we all understand from a linguistic point of view, is the ability to talk without interruptions. But it has a more general meaning in cognitive science, which is that you can do something with low effort. So think about driving a car. In some ways, it's weird to think about driving a car fluently, but it is a skill that you've learned to the point, if you drive regularly, that you don't have to process a lot of mental bandwidth to think about doing it. I drove here to work this morning and it was just sort of in the back of my mind. I wasn't really thinking about like, okay, where is the brake pedal? Where's my 10 and 2 with the steering wheel? I'm not thinking about that, right? But am I a great driver? No, probably not. I'm a middling driver. Is there better levels of driving skill I could attain? Definitely. Definitely. Like you compare me to like a race car driver or someone who, drives a taxi. Well, in Mumbai, for instance, I would be a disaster driving there, right? Like it's a much more chaotic, frenetic environment to drive a car in. If you drive there, you're a much better driver than I am. And so why is that? Why is it that I can spend lots of time driving and my skill level is essentially flat? And this is related to what you're talking about. You work your job, it's stressful in the beginning, you're learning a bit, but then after like 5-10 years, you're not a top performer, but you're not getting that much better. You could spend another 10 years and all that's going to change is going to be more comfortable, more fluent as it is. And a big part of this is what I talk about in the book is Anders Ericsson's research on deliberate practice, which is this idea that simply doing something over and over again tends to just make it more automatic. It doesn't necessarily make you better at it, or if it does so very slowly. And so often what we need to do to master our skills when we've reached that fluent stage is a kind of unlearning, is a kind of, okay, we need to bring back the deliberate attention, make it more effortful, focus on things that have long since been pushed to our subconscious to actually make improvements. And that's uncomfortable and it's difficult. And so I think that's one of the real reasons why you need this mastery mindset to make progress. Because just showing up at your job and just doing it for another 10 years is not going to make you that much better once you've reached that plateau. It's just going to make you more comfortable.
Okay. So if I need to develop that mastery mindset,
Yeah.
what are the three steps that you talk about this? Seeing, doing, and taking feedback as one principle, and there are many maxims within this framework that you have put out
Yeah.
there.
Well,
So talk to me about I'm actually in this job and I'm a programmer or I'm an architect or I'm a musician or I'm somebody who's running my own business, and
yeah.
I'm somebody who wants to build this mastery mindset. So, which
Hmm.
means that you got a fantastic framework that I saw with these 12 maxims that are coming in under these three, I would say, pillars, which is, seeing, doing, and taking feedback. So,
Yeah.
talk to me about it. And therefore, if I were to build a discipline in my head on how I need to do it, uh, talk to me about a few interesting points. I'm sure they will pick up the stuff from the book, but give me some large headlines which help
Yeah.
me understand what the process is.
Well, I mean, part of writing this book is that you're just encountering so much research, so many different ideas that, these individual trees, you're like, what's the forest? What's the big picture? And so the eventual framework that I thought best organized these ideas is dividing it between these three factors. And I mean, they sound simple, but that betrays a lot of nuance, a lot of detail. So seeing, doing, and getting feedback. So seeing is the idea that most of what we know comes from other people.
Mm.
that human creativity, human problem solving is like the tip of the iceberg of all the cultural learning, all the transmitted knowledge that we get from other people. And so to achieve excellence in any field, you are really standing atop mostly knowledge created by other people.
Mm.
And where this was interesting for me was that there's lots of examples of differences in our ability to learn from other people. So if an environment makes it a little bit easier or a little bit harder, that can totally change the trajectory of not only just mastery of an individual, but for an entire group. So
Mm.
the story that I open the book with is one that was given to me by the blogger John Green, talking about Tetris proficiency. And
Mm.
this is, not something that is really important for our jobs or for our work, but I thought it was beautiful because it illustrates something that is deep and important across many fields. And here's the idea. The game comes out in 1990. People are obsessed with it. They're witnessing falling blocks. But the best players, the people who they're keeping world records about, are nowhere close to as good as like 13-year-old kids are today. And the
Mm.
difference is that in the last decade or so, there's been an explosion of online streaming and tools and tournaments and basically things that make it much easier for players to learn techniques and strategies from each other. So a new player today who's like 10 years old can go
Mm.
online and be like, oh, this is the right way to play elite level Tetris. And they can quickly learn what would have taken trial and error, a decade or more for a lot of players to get to. And in some cases they would never get to it because of what we talked about this increasing automaticity of maybe using an inefficient method. You just keep using it more and more. And so this idea of seeing is very important because essentially in our work, in our professional lives, it's huge because you can learn stuff from school and that does give you a foundation. Certainly in the hard sciences, the STEM fields, you need it to be able to work. But so much of what matters for performing at the frontier of a discipline is not taught in school. It's taught in the field, in practice. And
Mm.
so if you are in a company that's doing cutting edge work and you are able to witness the best people doing it, you're able to see their explanations. I mean, that can be orders of magnitude difference. You can be the smartest person in the world, but if you're working at the wrong company, you're not going to make an important contribution. And that's an
Mm.
unfair truth, but it is also something that's very important to recognize, is that being able to see and learn from other people, it's huge. Do is the obvious idea that we get better through practice. And I spend a lot of time talking about exactly what practice is doing, exactly what it is doing to make us better. Because on the one hand, practice is essential. You can't avoid it. But on the other hand, there's some misconceptions about what practice is doing and about what the best way to practice is. And so I spend a lot of time talking about, how we can kind of, in some ways, overcome our own brain's tendencies to like do practice that isn't as helpful for us. And then finally, feedback. This is so important. And I open this section of the book talking about how there's whole fields where experts are supremely confident and they actually are very mediocre in their ability to make judgments or that we would normally expect of experts. And the reason is simply that if you don't have good feedback, if you're
Mm.
not getting information from your environment that's allowing you to adjust and calibrate your skills, basically it's just what we talked about. You keep doing something, you get more and more confident, you get more and more comfortable, but your improvement pretty much flatlines. And
Yeah.
so these three ingredients are important, but they are really just a starting point for thinking about how you're learning, because it's not like this is a trick or a technique. It's
Mm.
bigger than that. It's more like, okay, if I'm in an environment where learning from other people is going to be hard, I could be the smartest, most hardworking person on the planet, and I'm not going to make progress in this skill.
Mm.
If I'm in a field which has poor feedback, then I got to be very careful, because I can be feeling really confident and still be making lousy predictions. And similarly, if I'm doing the wrong kind of practice, you can spend 10,000 hours and not become world class at anything. So I think there's both potential and danger here. And so that's why I think it's so important to understand these principles.
And in fact, you make a very interesting point in the book, Scott, where you talk about the power of apprenticeship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I think you cover that point very well, saying that there are fields where apprenticeship is actually done, in professions like music and
Yeah.
other maybe in a medical profession where a lot of apprenticeship helps you build mastery, right?
Hmm.
So talk to me about the power of apprenticeship in building mastery.
So apprenticeship is a kind of I think when you look at, so I'll just preface this, whenever you look at any learning system or any kind of framework, there's always strengths and weaknesses. There's always things that it does well and things that it doesn't do so well. So if I were to like talk about learning systems or learning environments, um, I don't have any that I would point to and be like, well, this is the ideal way to learn everything,
Mm,
right? It's always this trade-off. And so to me, what apprenticeships do really well is that you are getting good feedback. The skill is very close to the one that's actually practiced, which is a major problem. I talk about it a lot in my first book, Ultralearning, of this indirectness, where you are in a classroom, the teacher doesn't know where you're going to be working, they don't know what you're going to be doing, so they try to give you quite generic skills, and
mm,
sometimes that's useful. I mean, if you're going to go in any math field, learning algebra is important, you have to do it, and I don't really think there's another way of doing it. But I went to business school, and I remember sitting through a lot of classes that would talk about business strategy in such an abstract, detached way that you really question whether or not these kids would not just be better off working for a couple years than sitting through these classes. And I think that's true of a lot of fields. I
yeah.
did this kind of computer science sort of self-education project that I talked about at when we opened from MIT. And like MIT classes are great, but they're super conceptual and abstract. And so you could definitely just take all those classes and not be a very good programmer. Whereas, what you need to do to program is program a lot. So apprenticeship gives you that repetition. It gives you that directness. It gives you those actual skills. What is apprenticeship? What is the weakness of apprenticeship? Well, the weakness of apprenticeship is that the people who are teaching you are too busy to teach you. They don't
Mm,
have time or patience to tell you how to do the job. And you are in an environment where you're trying to get work done. And because you're trying to get work done, there can be this sort of like, well, let's not let this person do the actual important work because they're going to screw it up, even if that's what they need to learn. So I think apprenticeship is just this essential vehicle. But when you're in an apprenticeship environment versus a school environment, you have these kind of like counterbalancing
mm,
weaknesses, that the school environment is indirect, but it's also like you have someone who it's their whole job to teach you. Maybe they're not doing a good job, but that's what their job is. You have peers. Everything is about learning. It's not about like, making sales quotas. Whereas when you're doing apprenticeship, it's so important to try to like get some of that school environment in the apprenticeship process, like be on projects where you can genuinely learn and grow, and be with people that you can ask stupid questions to and they can give you helpful answers, and you can navigate that social network. And when you're in the school, it's good to have the work experience and the things that are like, okay, this is actually what you're going to be doing, and so you can get that experience. And so I think apprenticeship is really important. It's underused, but it's also something that, essentially that's how we get good at our jobs. In almost every job is some form of apprenticeship.
fantastic. So my follow-up question to this, Scott, is so when you
Yeah.
look at the journey of mastery, when I
Hmm.
read through this book, uh, one thing that comes back, and I think it comes with a lot of your work that you do, is I tend to look at mastery when I know that I want to be the best in my profession.
Hmm.
Okay. But what profession I'm going to get in is something that I'm not sure when I'm in college or I'm in school.
Right.
Okay. And suddenly I'm in a job or
Yeah.
probably at work, and suddenly you're talking to me about mastery, right? And I'm not prepared. In my mental models are not there for building mastery. So
Hmm.
is there something that one needs to do? For example, I was thinking as I was reading your book that
Hmm.
in schools you start teaching subjects, right? But
Hmm.
when I saw what Edison did, or when
Yeah.
I saw the gaming example that you just gave,
Yeah.
one of the things that I see is uh, I have to be the best tennis player in the world. I have to be the best golfer in the world. So therefore, does mastery start with defining a profession first that you would get interested in, and then you start teaching the subjects, which leads to mastery?
Well, this is a really interesting question because I think what we're hitting on here is not just a question of like what's involved in becoming world class and what's involved in mastering a skill, but also thinking about you as an individual, you and your career. What is the sort of portfolio of skills that you bring to the table? And I think this is a deep question because a lot of the research, like again, if we go to Anders Ericsson is the person that I love to cite here because he did so much to our understanding of expertise and mastery. He was really focused on, I would call them fairly narrow professions. So like chess grandmasters and, tennis players and people who had kind of reached the pinnacle of a specialization of some narrow skill that was well defined. And the author David Epstein, he kind of wrote a book critiquing Anders Ericsson to just sort of talk about like, well, in a lot of workplaces, being really, really good at one thing is not actually what the game is, right? That it's about having this sort of portfolio of skills, this range, as he calls it. And I think that's a useful point. I think, I don't have the citation offhand, but I recall running into a paper which was arguing about double majors, so people who take two different majors in university, having like kind of the one major is sort of like the specialist animal. So it's like it's the giant panda that only eats bamboo, and having the double major is like being the omnivore. It's like you're being like the city rat who can eat every kind of garbage. And in an environment which is very stable and predictable, being the specialist pays off because you're only learning what's relevant to that job. You're going to create a lot of waste if you learn skills that you don't end up using. But if you have more breadth, you have more tolerance to variation and risk. So I think that is, as a young person who doesn't know their career or who is in an early stage of their career, I do think um, you need to have this kind of portfolio analysis because if you, let's say, okay, what is the highest paying profession? And like the classic example that often gets cited is like petroleum engineers. So petroleum engineers, I don't know when this was. This would have been like in the early 2000s or something. Were like, exorbitantly paid because there was a shortage of them. There was a real boom in like, gas and oil fracking. So if you were a petroleum engineer and you were just graduating with your like PhD at that time, they were paying you like millions of dollars to do your work, right? And you're a new student, you're like, I want to go in, like, I just want to make money. Maybe you're just a hypothetical, super materialistic student. I'm going to go into petroleum engineering. And then you get to the end of your career and then you find out, oh, actually gas prices, oil have fallen and they're laying people off. And now you have this like really well-developed hyper specialty that turns out is useless for like most other lines of work. And so you've made an investment that was like owning one stock. If it does well, you've made much more money, but the safer strategy is to own a portfolio of different stocks so you have diversification. So I tend to think of that problem in terms of, if you're really young, like if you're going into school, it's better to choose again, there's nothing wrong with choosing based on prestige. I think a lot of people know this, especially in India. If you go to an IIT, you're probably going to get a job even if it's not in tech later because they know you're smart. That's the game everyone knows. Everyone knows you're playing. But in terms of just content knowledge of things that you're trying to do, I think having a bit more breadth, knowing a little bit more of some different things is probably valuable to a point. And when you start out in your work, it's helpful to look for workplaces that also introduce variability, that introduce different contexts, different industries. So my classic example of this is if you're going to go into accounting, for instance, you can go into a big accounting firm, which has lots of clients in lots of different industries, or you can go work for a firm and do their internal accounting. But if you work for the firm where you do their internal accounting, you get really familiar with one industry, one practices, one way of doing things. And it can be a little bit harder to switch fields. Not impossible, but a little harder. Whereas if you went to one of the big accounting firms, you can basically work anywhere you want after that. And there's a similar process in a lot of industries. So I think early on, having that intense, varied experience, even if it's not ideally what you want from a work-life balance, can be beneficial because it sets you up so that, well, you have this sort of foundation. So if you get into a new job and you need to spend the next couple years quickly getting yourself acclimatized, you're in a much better position.
So I think that's the reason why you talk about this point on varied practice,
Yeah.
right? which is very key to building mastery, right?
Hmm.
Can you talk to me about the importance of varied practice? Maybe that's something that's very critical early in your career. You even talk
Yeah.
about, go and join a company that's got, volatility, stressful,
Right.
situations, and that prepares you for, the future. So you even talk about that in the book. So how does varied practice help you build mastery? Because these are things that are not normally told in schools and colleges. They say, go to the large company,
Yeah.
get into a routine job, get comfortable, and then your
Yeah.
your muscle becomes lazy, right? Then you're not able to switch and do things. So I found these very interesting things that you talk in the book. So how does varied practice help build mastery?
Right. So in that there's a chapter I have which I call variability over repetition, and this is a more specific point. So we were talking about this kind of, I'll call it like the portfolio model of skill development, which is not so much a question of how do you learn, but a question of like you're making investments in your own human capital. What is the right like to use a investing metaphor? What's the right way to make those investments? And I tend to think that you're probably better off with some degree of diversification. Not like you learn every single skill, the jack of all trades is the master of none, but that you have a little bit more breadth. So, changing economic conditions, changing opportunities, you're a bit more flexible. This other idea about variable practice is a deeper cognitive science principle that I think like this applies even if you were trying to just be a specialist. So even if you just wanted to be only a chess player, or as I talk about in the book, like only a jazz player, this is very important. And the basic idea is that when we practice things, a tendency is to want to like repeat it until we get it right. So just keep repeating it until you get it right. And there's a whole interesting line of research from called contextual interference, interleaving. Uh, there's a whole bunch of different names where this research has been done with different paradigms, which basically shows that for a lot of skills, if you are able to mix up the practice so that you are practicing different skills that are similar in alternation, in different orders, at a random schedule, it has two effects. One, you tend to learn a little bit more slowly. So this is sort of the obvious reason why we try to favor repetition often, is that it seems like we're making faster progress. But if you average out over all those skills, you tend to be more efficient doing the varied practice than the very consistent or repetitive practice. And this manifests in different ways, but one of the things that I think it really helps with is developing a kind of deeper understanding or deeper flexibility with the skill. So when you continually practice the same skill over and over and over again, you get faster, fluent at it very quickly, like what we were talking about. But what is sort of weakened in that is that because you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, the ability to decide whether or not you should use that skill, like is this the situation that calls for it, is relatively under practiced. And so this leads to what some researchers call the paradox of transfer. So transfer is this idea of you learn one skill, does it help you with something else? And what they find is that these varied practice schedules tend to make learning slower. They tend to make, if you're trying to get good at one particular thing, it makes it a bit slower, but it tends to make your ability to learn new things better. And so I think this is a very interesting idea. Obviously, there's limitations to it. I don't want to suggest that, you learn 10 different subjects is going to make you learn subject 11 a lot faster. That's not, I think, what's particularly shown by the research. But it does show that if you are in environments where you are practiced in a varied way, you're able to pick up new cases, new problems, new skills within the discipline more quickly. And I think that's very important for mastery, where, in a lot of our professional fields, it's not about being able to, punch out a widget, a tenth of a second faster. It's about encountering a new situation and resolving it appropriately.
Okay. I think no conversation, will be complete without AI, which is
Yeah.
really something that
Right, of
everybody talks
course.
about. And I think
Yeah.
in this book, you talk about, how AI can influence building mastery, and you talk about known practice and unknown practice, right? You talk
Hmm.
about the concept, and therefore how, even though there is AI, the fact
Hmm.
that There are known practices which probably AI will know, but unknown practices which probably is not known to the world, and therefore that being a big point in building mastery. So talk to me
Yeah.
about that, and I think that was a very interesting concept that I really loved.
Well, I gotta say, first of all, like everyone, including myself, is just gobsmacked by the developments of large language models and generative AI. This was something that I think really was unexpected to people 10 years ago. And when I was writing this book, I mean, one of the reviewers, I love her, but she was like very, very critical of me because I didn't write more about AI. She was like, "You're writing this book and you don't have a big section on AI." And the reason I didn't is because book publishing is a slow process. I started this book before ChatGPT had even come out, and it's going to be out hopefully for another decade or two. And there's a real risk of making pronouncements about new technologies that just seem totally ridiculous 10 years later. And it's just because making predictions about things is hard. And so I personally, I think our own ability to say where these technologies are going and what the actual implications are is pretty weak right now. So I don't want to be here with my crystal ball saying, this is what's going to happen now with large language models. And I think anyone who is saying that is talking out of their butt a little bit. But what I will say about it, and what I think is kind of generally true of technologies, is that technologies enable new cognitive powers in people, and they also open up new cognitive terrain for skills that we hadn't appreciated or imagined before. And so I think often when there is a new technology, we often focus on the substitution effect first. So we often
Mm,
focus on what is this replacing that previously people were doing, and it seems like the share for the human mind has shrunk. So, the classic example of this that everyone talks about is Socrates. And Socrates, when paper was coming out and people were writing down ideas, which previously was this oral tradition that was memorized speeches that were handed down from teacher to student, he was saying, you know what, this is going to rob the faculty of memory because we had to memorize things and now students will just be able to look it up. And the thing is that he wasn't wrong. The
correct.
ancient Greeks had these elaborate mnemonic techniques to memorize things, and we don't really use them anymore. And we don't
Correct.
have as good memories as Socrates did. But what he missed was, by focusing on this substitution effect, he was missing this new domain, which was that once you write down knowledge, all of a sudden you can accumulate far more than a person could study in a lifestyle in a durable format. So what he was focused on was, well, you're not going to be able to memorize things. But what he didn't understand was that now that you didn't have to memorize things, you could accumulate far more knowledge that could be inside any one person's head. And so I tend to think that the substitution effect, the way that we see, well, all these like kind of low end programming tasks can now be taken over with AI. Or, I had to, hire some illustrator to storyboard some images, and now I can just get AI to do it for me for this first draft and stuff. But what I think is missing is all the ways that having these tools in the long run is going to enable new forms of creativity, new forms of problem solving, new forms of knowledge representation discovery. And I mean, the reliability and usefulness and domain of these tools still has to be proven. I think they still have a lot of bugs in them. Like, I wouldn't use large language models for doing research for my book because they make too many mistakes and they get stuff wrong. And so I'd rather still use Google Scholar and some of these existing tools. Like, I'd rather use Wikipedia because I know Wikipedia sometimes makes mistakes, but there was a real human who was really trying to cite things properly when they were writing those essays. Um, but who knows where it's going to go in the future. And so I think all I would say right now is to keep an open mind and to keep open the idea that while some skills will be substituted, new skills are going to be created. And I think it's those new skills that are going to be created that they may end up defining the future of work for the next 30 or 40 years. If it turns out that, what it means to be a programmer just fundamentally changes when you can have an AI that can do like 80% of the programming work. Well, that 20% that they can't do, and the other 10%, which is involving like managing the AI, that's going to become super important. And so I think the people who are aware of this and who are on the cutting edge are going to be people who are like paying attention to this trend and being like, okay, well, what do I need to be really good at to make use of this technology in a productive way.
Okay. Uh, so one of the things, Scott, that I think why this book is so important in the time that we are going through this change of the future of work that we are doing. Uh,
Hmm.
what I believe is happening, the transformation that's happening today, is we were a craft-based world before industrialization took over,
Hmm.
right? Uh, then when knowledge work started, I think that's where we started our conversation.
Yeah.
Craft is becoming more and more important, right? Because now, if in fact you talk about this whole thing of saying that distributed mastery is
Right.
becoming important for problem solving, right? So
Hmm.
therefore, when I'm going to be working with multiple number of people, with multiple collaborators, the fact that I'll collaborate with somebody who is an expert, who has a mastery in that particular area, is what I would probably seek out. And therefore, do you believe that individuals who actually finish their degrees, go into work, the need for actually building the craft is becoming more and more important, and therefore the application of this continuous repetitive learning, the fact that I need to use my intuition. You talk about examples of Da Vinci, really looking at how paintings get done by copying first, and then quality is
Yeah.
more important than quantity. So some of these principles, do you think, are going to get back to work? Okay, because earlier, I think, in the
Hmm.
last 100 years, it was all about, give me lots of cars, just get mass
Yeah. Yeah.
produce them and send it to me. But now it's all about mass personalization and customization, which means that I need to be good in my craft, and therefore the need for mastery is becoming more and more important at workplace, rather than just being performance led. Would you agree with that
Right.
statement?
I mean, I think if you look at the overall trend of work over what you were saying, like the last 150 years or so, it definitely has some of these features that the economy before mass production, before really industrialization had spread throughout all the industries, was highly skilled. I mean, most people who were in the artisanal class, you needed to learn a fairly complex and cognitively demanding skill in order to produce the work. If you think about like how cars were made before Henry Ford, I mean, you would have a mechanic who they knew how to make the entire car. They would hand make all the parts. They would be putting it together like it was like a piece of art that they were making, right?
Yeah.
And then what changed was Henry Ford was like, well, if I make all the parts super standardized and I get people to do one little bit and they get really good at that one little bit, I can make the cars much cheaper. And so what we saw was a real de-skilling of a lot of these professions. That it used to
Mm.
be someone who was like the equivalent of like a master's in car mechanic was replaced by a guy who this is someone who just okay, maybe barely speaks the language. They're coming in there and like, okay, do this, and you do that for 60 hours a week until you're exhausted, and the
Yeah.
result was that you had cheap cars. And so I do think we saw a bit of a reversal of that trend with information technology and automation, that some of those things that were done by people in this very repetitive machine like way started to be done by actual machines. And so what was left, this again kind of substitution in what was created in the aftermath, were professions that were more creative, that were more knowledge demanding. And so I think we are living in the aftermath of that world, that starting from 70s, 80s, 90s, I talk about this idea of education polarization, of income inequality polarization, where the trend in the United States, at least, is because of things like not only automation but also outsourcing and this kind of stuff, that you see a real growth in inequality at the top end and a compression at the bottom, which is sort of consonant with this idea that these middle class factory jobs just kind of evaporated, and either you became a coder who was making six figures at Silicon Valley, or you worked the drive-through window at a restaurant and took orders and got paid minimum wage. And I mean, that's an extreme idea, but it is reflective of the fact that we used to have a lot of professions that were medium skilled, that required a little bit of training, but not that much, and could be done relatively repetitively, that, we can just get computers to do them now. Travel agents, a lot of bookkeeping. When you used to have to write it in a physical book, it was a very different job than when you had Excel. And so I think there is a real question about how much this trend is going to continue. I tend to think that it probably will continue. I know there's some people who think we're maybe on the cusp of a new industrial revolution of de-skilling because of these large language models, and they can point to some evidence in their favor. But I tend to think that this trend is broadly just because the kinds of things that we get people to do, it's easier to automate the things that are simpler. And so you kind of just, as technology develops, you get into a zone where it used to be people doing everything, and then it was machines doing just kind of like the very, very simplest parts, and then the more complicated skills. And so as we move up and up, I think the role of people is going to increase. We're going to be increasingly having people not just do technical skills, but you're going to be need the soft skills. You're going to need the people skills of being able to put together these automated systems and link it all together. So I tend to think that more skill, more knowledge, more education, I think that trend is going to continue, but we'll see.
Fantastic. So that's great, Scott. I think we're pretty much coming to the end of this conversation, and I have a couple of rapid fire questions for you.
Sure. I'll try to
Uh,
be rapid fire answers.
so the first question that I have for you is, what does success mean to you?
I mean, success is, again, like, it's the meaning of words. I think success has a kind of popular definition at large. But if you're asking me, what do I drive for? What do I want to achieve in my own life? I think I want to do work that I'm proud of, and I want to be, happy and fulfilled with, my personal life. And so those two things can sometimes be in tension. As the drive to improve and work on things is, it's not the same as taking a vacation, but I think they're more harmonious than just trying to make a lot of money or achieve, outside symbols of status and recognition.
Great. Fantastic answer, especially the fact that you're talking about fulfillment and something that you're proud you're proud of what you are doing. I think these are two signs of success. I think these are key points that I'm picking up. Uh, if you were to advise an 18-year-old in a university today, what's one piece of advice you would give them?
I think I think one thing that I would try to encourage someone who is, and it depends on the person, but I think what I would encourage someone who is maybe listening to this podcast, who is interested and has the mastery mindset and has ambitions, is to try to do work on work on challenging projects that you're excited about. I think you need to have both. It needs to be things that you're excited about. It can't be chores that have been assigned to you, because just grinding through a lot of drudgery, it's not really a good indicator of your potential. But at the same time, I think taking on challenging projects when you're young and when you have the capacity to work on things, when you're as smart as you're going to be, when you have the most free time that you're going to have, I think it really sets you up for things. And so when I think about myself, I'm very grateful that I did take on challenges when I was in that position, when I didn't have kids, when I had the ability to prove myself. But also when I see other people, I can't stress that enough, that the people who are just doing things that are hard and interesting to them, they're the people who, even if that project itself turns out to be a total waste of time, they end up going on to do good things. Whereas the person who is like, what, how do I get the easy A in the class and not work too hard? Well, I mean, they're going to have a harder time later. Or the opposite, people who are just doing what they're told, that's like maximizing drudgery. I think those people also turn out to underperform later.
Brilliant. Maximizing drudgery is a great, takeaway for me, and I think that's very interesting. What's one piece of advice that stays with you even today? You may have got lots, but what's one piece of advice over these years that you got that stays with you even today, which you value very much?
I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to articulate it very well because it's more a feeling than a piece of advice. But the idea that you are in charge of your own life and you can do whatever you want to do. And I think this is something, I don't want to be too stereotypical here, but especially in like more traditional cultures like in India, where there is a strong familial pressure, there's a strong pressure from society to conform to certain things. I think this idea that, you are the captain of your own ship and you are the one steering it is really important because of how important, it's not about performance, about mastery. It's about that personal agency that, like, if you're going to achieve goals, you are going to be the one to do them. And so I think sometimes, especially when we're buffeted from outside forces, there's a real tendency to look at all these constraints, look at all these things impinging on us and feel kind of like, well, I don't have a choice. And I think the more that you can take agency of like, well, those things exist, but I'm still charting my course in and around them, is so important. And so the first time that I kind of got exposed to that philosophy, I think it really was an inflection point for me. And it would be the advice or the attitude I would like to instill in anyone else.
Great. Uh, Imagine if you want to have a dream dinner with a couple of people that you would like to chat and learn from them. Who would they be and why?
Well, if I can pick anyone through any period of time, I like the like living and dead category. If we're having a fantasy dinner, then I would like to have a dinner with yeah, Richard Feynman, John Anderson, the cognitive psychologist, and maybe uh, those are the two that are coming to mind right now. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. There's probably a dozen more, but selecting it down to a manageable guest list would be hard.
And why? And why?
Well, Richard Feynman just inspires me because I feel like his attitude and approach to life and learning like has been the major inspiration for my life. Like, I mean, this is someone who was not only incredibly accomplished, won a Nobel Prize in physics, but had a very deep appreciation of learning and understanding things that has stuck with me to this day. And John Anderson, because I feel like he's probably the smartest psychologist that I've ever encountered upon reading, and has the deepest and most thorough appreciation for how the mind works. And I would love to just chat with him because I feel like, compared to him, everyone else is a specialist. He's the true, expert among experts there.
Great. And my last question for you, Scott, in this conversation is what's one thing that you believe in that others don't agree with you?
Oh, um, I mean, it's going to sound a little trite. And I mean, obviously, other people do believe in it. But I think the idea that anyone can learn anything, I think, is not widely held. And I hold it deeply, that I think that if you can break things down enough and you can put in the effort, then anyone can learn anything. I think a lot of people believe that there's like hard mental limits on some people acquiring some skills. And I just don't think those exist. I don't mean that some people won't learn things faster or have an easier time at things. I just mean the potential is there.
Great. So thanks a lot, Scott, for your time and all the very best for the success of this fantastic
Oh,
book.
thank you so much.
I loved reading it, and I'm sure in this part of the world it's going to get a lot of response. And I'm happy that I've been able to talk to you on this new book that you're just getting it out. And all the very best. And thanks a lot for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.